Normally, we start in this webinar series with a few words about our lab for the guest. Not really necessary in this case because you already know us, but we're going to do it nevertheless.
And for everyone else who is not from the lab who's joining.
Yep.
Exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, you have the room.
All right, so as you know, we are the Brain-Computer Interface and Neural Engineering Laboratory at the School of Computer Science and Electronic Engineering of the University of Essex. We are a quite sizable BCI group. I guess probably in terms of number of PIs, we must be the biggest in the world, I think. So we are active in all areas of neural engineering and BCI, but mainly we focus on the decoding and interpretation of neural signals, mostly non-invasive technologies like EEG and deaf ears. And we come from diverse backgrounds. We have engineers, we have neuropsychologists, and we have a very interdisciplinary and collaborative environment. And our areas of application really span the whole, let's say, the usual things in BCI, passive BCIs, but we have a focus on assistive technology, applications, and neurorehabilitation, as well as decision-making. All right, we are lucky to have access to very important facilities, including 3 Faraday cages, several EEG, FNIR systems. We also have a robot-guided transcranial magnetic stimulator. We have TDCS devices, eye trackers, access to lots of kinds of robots, mobile robots, and so on. And we have also been lucky in latest years to have secured important funding. And yeah, so we look forward to doing more of this great research, hopefully in collaboration with you too. And yeah, that's us. So let me introduce Jose to the people that don't know him already, maybe. So Dr. Jose Millan is a professor at the Carol Cockrell Curran Chair in the Sandra Family Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. I hope I really pronounce all this correctly. He's also a professor at the Department of Neurology at Dell Medical School, professor by courtesy in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, faculty of the Malva Clinic for the Neurosciences, and member of the Institute of Neuroscience. He's co-director of the University of Texas CARE Initiative and associate director of Texas Robotics. Dr. Millan received his PhD in computer science from the Technical University of Catalonia in Barcelona in 1992. Prior to joining University of Texas at Austin, he was a research scientist at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Ispra, in Italy, and then a senior researcher at the IDIAP Research Institute in Martigny, that's in Switzerland. Most recently, before Texas, he was the Deputy Foundation Chair in Brain-Machine Interface at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland. Professor Millan has several seminal contributions to the field of brain-machine interfaces, and especially based on EEG signals. Most of his achievements revolve around the design of brain-controlled robots. He has received several important recognitions for these pioneering achievements, notably the IEEE Systems Man in Cybernetics Norbert Wiener Award in 2011, Elevation in IEEE Fellow in 2017, and elected Fellow of the International Academy of Medical and Biological Engineering in 2020. In addition to his work on the fundamentals of BMI and design of neuroprosthetics, Dr. Millan is prioritizing the translation of BMI to people who live with motor and cognitive disabilities. In parallel, he is designing BMI technology to offer new interaction modalities for able-bodied people that augment their abilities. And although I might add, actually it's missing here, but Jose has also been the president of the International BCI Society, I believe between 19 and 22. But apart from all this, although none of these achievements is small, I would say maybe Jose's greatest feat is that he had the honor and privilege to be my PhD supervisor. So especially for that, Jose, congratulations. I had
It is
really
an
no
honor.
research
It is
that
an honor.
I wanted to say it. All right, so I will stop sharing, and then you can share your screen. And whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. So can you see the slides?
Yes, all good.
Okay, very good. So I am very pleased to be here with you today, in particular because of the personal relationship with many of you. Simi is the first, and the origin of much of the work that I will be presenting today is an evolution, and it started with Simi's work during his PhD and postdoc in my lab at EPFL. So very pleased to share this work with you. So let me start, even if I will not be talking much, a little bit, yes, but not much today, about our work on brain control robots and neuroprosthesis. And why I want to start with this, because in order for people to learn to control these devices, they need to go through a complex process, because whenever you need to control in real time a robot, it is more than delivering accurately brain commands. Timing is essential. And in order for a person to deliver the right command at the right time, this requires a lot of planning in our brain. When it is the right moment, you need to anticipate and deliver at the right moment. What means that the workload and the complexity of the interaction is way more complex than in an usual brain-computer interface experiment. Moreover, even if I will not be talking about this today, an essential component of controlling a brain robot, especially a robot that has some degree of autonomy, is to learn the model of what does it mean to deliver a given command in a given context. How will the robot be executing that command when the robot has some degree of autonomy? And this requires a complex learning process. And this is the motivation for today's talk, in the sense that if we take, and I will not go through this basic BCI loop here, if we take this BCI loop where the subject has to learn, then this learning process is amplified by the fact that they are interacting with autonomous intelligent systems. But the most important component is that during this learning process of the subject, and I will insist on that all along my talk, the subject has to volitionally change their brain signals in order to deliver better and better brain commands. This means that now we are facing this mutual learning problem, because if the subject is changing the distribution of their brain patterns, then this means that the machine learning component embedded in the BCI has to keep track of those changes. And the question is, how do we need to balance these two components? So first, before going technically there, let me remind you something that all of you who are working in BCI know very well. And it is a problem of the non-stationarity of the brain signals that we are using to decode the intention of the subject. And this problem of non-stationarity, let me emphasize that, is not only manifested in EEG or non-invasive signals. This is an intrinsic property of neural activity, what means that no matter whether you are recording intracortical signals, cortical signals with EEG, or scalp signals with EEG, these will be manifesting over there. And the problem of non-stationarity is that eventually you will be recording some calibration data in order to build your decoder, and you can build a very nice decoder that will be separating class 1 from class 2. But in practice, whenever you are deploying that decoder another day, the distribution will be shifted to another part of the input space, and despite the fact that eventually in that new distribution, you can still find a frontier that will separate the two distributions. This original distribution will fail because this new distribution eventually will fall only on one side of the original hyperplane. So this is the problem of non-stationarity, and we need to cope with that. So one way that we are coping with this problem is to use a Bayesian framework, because our decoders are probabilistic. And here what I am showing you is an experiment where over the x-axis you will have the samples, EEG samples or feature vectors that we are extracting from the EEG in real time. And then we are passing those feature vectors to the BCI in order to come up with a probability distribution. It is class 1, class 2. And here what I am projecting is not the actual probability distribution of the output of the BCI, but the probability of decoding the correct class, so as to visualize better the situation that we may be facing with a BCI. So if we have a good BCI, you can see that in fact, for every single sample over here, the red points are indicating the probability of the BCI issuing the correct command. And you can see that most of these red points are on the top part of the of the graph, meaning that indeed the BCI was decoding correctly. The intention most of the time, because in fact you can see that from time to time there will be chunks of decisions that will be definitely wrong. And now the problem is that if you trust any of these individual decisions, you will be making a substantial amount of errors in these chunks. How can we robustify this decision-making process? Well, we can use this Bayesian approach because we can now integrate over time the probability distributions for every single sample. And this is what you see here in the blue lines. This is the integration process of accumulating evidence based on every single output of the BCI. And now you can see the nice properties that we can achieve in a rather good situation like this one. For example, you can see that when the probability distribution is clearly on the top part of the graph, this integration very rapidly rises to the point that they will achieve a certain evidence threshold that will tell us, okay, now we have accumulated enough evidence for being rather sure that this is the intention of the person and this command will be delivered. When we have a probability distribution that is rather poor, like in this case around 200 samples, you can see that indeed this probability distribution accumulation process will start going down, but this feedback will provide the user with sufficient information to eventually modify the brain patterns so as to bring up the accumulation process and again delivering the correct command. Of course, this is not without any cost, because let's take this other example around 800 samples, where you see that initially it is going down, then it is going up, but this is not sufficient during a certain amount of time to reach the correct threshold. And in these cases, rather than keeping the accumulation process going on forever, the strategy that we use is that after a given reasonable time, several seconds, we simply come up with the decision that, in fact, there is no reliable decision that we can make, so that this will be considered a no decision, a timeout trial. And you can see also over here this kind of continuous line around 0.5 probability. And this is if we take the green vertical lines as the end of every trial, well, this is representing essentially the uncertainty associated to the new trial where the subject has not yet made up, which is the command that they want to deliver. So they are essentially 0.5 probability distribution. And this is what you see in these continuous lines. So let me, I was telling you, most of these fundamental work was done by Simis during his PhD thesis. And now I would like to show you one of the works that he did. And the question here is, if we have this mutual learning problem, where the user and the machine have to adapt to each other, well, given that we are living in this era of super powerful machine learning algorithms, can we not come up with an algorithm, machine learning algorithm, that will avoid any subject training? And this is what we wanted to explore in this experiment. And in this experiment, subjects were controlling this text entry system that we call it brain tree. And in brain tree, and you see this is the alphabet with eventually some additional symbols that will allow you to, for example, put an space or delete the last character that was selected. But the most important part of this visualization is that the operational range of the BCI at any given time is this orange bubble over here. And in this orange bubble, you can see this red vertical line that is separating into the operational space, so that if now the subject delivers the right command, since in this particular case there is only one letter left, this letter will be selected. Whereas if the subject delivers a left command, this red vertical line will need to move towards the left in order to split again this remaining set of letters into two. And how this is done, this is important element of this implementation. We have behind a language model that will be splitting this tree in a way that we have essentially more or less half probability on the left side and half probability on the right. And when I say half probability, is with respect to the context, and the context is the characters that have been already selected. So that now, using the language models and the probability, the statistical distributions of words, we know that if the subject has already selected the characters C and E, well, there will be almost 50% probabilities that the subject wants to write car as compared to any other word over there. And this is the reason why the tree and this red vertical line is placed in such an intelligent way. Well, what do we mean by developing an intelligent or a powerful machine learning algorithm that will allow us to reduce the training time for subjects? What we mean is that if we take any probabilistic decoder, we have essentially a finite mixture model where, given the samples that we are acquiring, the EEG, that is X, the variable X, we need to infer which is the class that this sample is associated to. It is the right command, it is the left BCI command. This is what we want to infer. And the algorithm, and I will not enter into the details of the algorithm today, but of course, if you want, I can give you more details. And I am fortunate that Simis is here. He can even give you more details. The important thing is that when we have this contextual information that I was introducing you, we can infer with a certain certainty which is the label of the sample that we have at this present time. And we want to exploit this contextual information to accelerate the convergence of this process of building a model that from the EEG, we will be inferring the samples that they belong to. And this is the augmented finite mixture model that, that we derive. So without more technical details, let me show you the basic outcome of this experiment. So we were comparing a group of subjects, some of whom were experts, meaning they were already, they had already experience in using a BCI. Some of them were naive, meaning this was the very first time they were using our system. And all of them started with a generic decoder, not a personalized decoder, a generic. The same for all of them. And now they had to write a certain amount of words, in particular 3 words, in a fixed order under 3 conditions. And the conditions were randomly allocated. Here, for the purpose of my talk today, I will be only comparing 2 conditions. In one case, we were using this contextual awareness algorithm that is completely unsupervised, and that it is simply inferring from the context, which is the most probable label for the sample that we have just extracted from the EEG. The subject was also attempting to write the 3 words using a fully supervised model, because we know the words that they want to write. We know which is the correct sequence of commands that they need to deliver via their BCI in order to select the correct characters that will compose the target word. And we will be using these labels, the inferred one or the correct one, in order to update in real time the parameters of our decoder. So long story short, what you can see over here is for every modality, for every kind of subject, and the average of all the subjects, which was the spelling speed, how many characters they could write per minute, and the command accuracy, how accurate every BCI command was decoded. And I remind you, everyone started with a generic decoder. And you can see that all of them were achieving very high performance. In fact, every subject was capable to write the required words, and there was an additional one that was a free word that they wanted to write. They were writing those words correctly since the very first attempt. And you can see also that there was no statistical difference between the 2 algorithms, the context awareness, unsupervised, and the supervised algorithm. Both of them were converging at the same speed, at the same performance. So we thought, okay, we have solved the problem. Indeed, we can deploy powerful machine learning algorithms that will avoid the need for first calibration, acquiring calibration data, and second, and importantly, equally importantly, long training times for the subject. However, we wanted to flip the coin, because if it is true that machine learning is avoiding subjects training, this means that the machine learning should be helping people to produce better and better distributions of the EEG associated to class 1 and class 2. And in order to check which is the evolution, whenever the subjects were using the two algorithms of these distributions, were they really moving away as the subjects were making better use of their algorithms because the algorithms is learning the correct parameters of the decoders? What we are showing over here is an index of separability of the two distributions, and in particular, we will use in the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the two multivariate normal class distributions, because we have the EEG that is encoded in a high dimensional input space. And what you can see, surprisingly, is that even if the machine learning algorithms is converging better and better to the optimal decoder for every single subject, the separability of the distribution of EEG that subjects were generating as they were using their BCI was degrading over time. It was at a certain level of performance at the very beginning, and this separability was becoming shorter and shorter as they use, and this was the case for both algorithms. So bottom line, it seems that at least in certain circumstances, too much machine learning is preventing subject learning. So as a result, we have been using other modalities of machine learning where we were not using such a sophisticated machine learning algorithm, and we were keeping fixed the model, the decoder, for a given amount of time, so that the subject has to learn how to generate the EEG that will maximize the performance of the decoder. And we are updating the decoder only when, after a given training session, we discover that there will be another decoder, so set of parameters in our decoder, that will perform statistically better than the previous one. Only then we update the decoder. And to show you this learning process of the subject in this case and the whole system together, let me use this recent experiment where also SIMIS was involved. This was an experiment that we conducted with a group of tetraplegic people in a clinic in Germany, in Bochum, and they were learning to control their own wheelchair. And they were highly tetraplegic people. All of them were Asia A level. And you can see that in this particular case, the lesion was so high that the subject required even assisted ventilation during the, the subject requires, so we had to use it to have the assisted ventilation during the whole experiment. So let me come to the major conclusion of this study. And what I am showing you over here is the final experiment that they did once the three subjects that we were working with learn or achieve a sufficient level of control of their wheelchair. So this is an environment that is an ecological one, because this is the rehabilitation ward in the hospital that the subjects need to visit regularly to do their rehabilitation sessions. And the experiment was to bring the wheelchair that always started at the bottom right part of the rehabilitation ward along a trajectory. This is the black trajectory that you see over here. This is the ideal trajectory. I will tell you what is that in a moment. That has to go through several waypoints. waypoint 1, the wheelchair has to go on the left side of the waypoint 1. It has to reach the end of the rehabilitation ward and then turn around the waypoint 2. On the way back, it has to go over the right side of the waypoint 3 while avoiding these beds, rehabilitation beds over here. And finally, it has to turn and go out of the rehabilitation ward via the waypoint 4. So this is a mock-up. And in black, what you have is the optimal trajectory that we can compute using robotics criteria, like smoothness of the trajectory, safety distance to any obstacle in the environment while going through the waypoints. And now in color, what you have is out of the different trials that the 3 patients carry out in this environment, how often the wheelchair was passing by every cell in this environment, so that the more often the wheelchair goes through, the warmer will be the color. So that if the wheelchair doesn't go through, this will be black and dark blue. And if the wheelchair always goes through, it will be this kind of yellow. And now you can see very clearly, like, there is the emergence of this average trajectory in green and yellow that represents the average trajectory that the wheelchair was going through across all the trials. And you can see that this average trajectory is very close, and we can quantify that, very close to the optimal trajectory. So the subject achieved a sufficiently rather good level of brain control of their wheelchair. But what I am more interested on today is to tell you about this training process of the 3 subjects. Over here, you have the training days that the subjects went through, and you can see that clearly subject 1 was training for longer. And in fact, we know that the performance before executing these trajectories, the level of brain control of subject P1 was better than the level of control of subject P3, and P3 had a better level of control than P2. You also see that even if there were a limited number of days that subject P2 and P3 trained on, they had to go through several months of training. And you know the reason. These kind of people have a very fragile health, and so they cannot come every single day to the clinic because of these episodes of bad health that they have. Now, let me show you the evolution of this training across the different training sessions for each of the subjects. And I was telling you that we were adapting or modifying the decoder only a handful of times during this training process. And this is indicated by these vertical dotted lines. This is when the decoder was adapted. What I am showing you here also is the level of discriminability, separability, if you wish, in terms of the previous experiment, that the features that are incorporated in the decoder of every single subject at every single day achieve, meaning how much we can differentiate the different commands that the subject has to deliver using those features. And those features in this particular case are compacted the frequency components over the cortical locations. And now you can see that, let's take subject 1, that the subject 1 started with a rather good pattern that you can see over here, very weak, but clearly separable. And or separable. This is not in an index of separability. It is how much we can discriminate basis on these 2 blobs of volitional modulations of rhythmic activity over those 2 areas. And you can see that at the end of his training, these patterns were relatively preserved, but clearly these patterns were way stronger. In the case of P2, we see essentially a similar process, even if there were more changes, and there were also this stability at the very end. Whereas in the case of, of subject P3, P3 had a more chaotic pattern at the very beginning, and this pattern changed, but never converged on clear modulations apart from this medial left area. Now, I told you, P1 was better than P2, P2 was better than P3. And if now we take the evolution of this feature discriminability, how better these features were discriminating the different better mental commands over time, you can see that in the case of P1 and P2, I was wrong. The best subject was P1, the second best subject was P3, and the third subject was P2. You can see that P1 had a statistically strong increase in feature discriminability. This was also the case, weaker for subject P3. And subject P2, who was the worst subject, in fact, didn't change the feature discriminability. And this is why the patterns were very similar at the very beginning and at the very end. There was no learning for subject P3, P2. If we take also the discriminability index, that is essentially a Fisher score, and we correlate the discriminability index for every subject over their training process with the latency, how fast the subject could deliver the correct command at any given trial, then we can see that the stronger it is the Fisher score, the stronger is the discriminability index, the faster subject 1 and subject 3 could deliver those commands. And this is critical for controlling a wheelchair, any robotic device. Whereas in the case of subject 2, there was no statistical relationship. Again, showing the subject 2 couldn't learn. Now, if during the use of a brain-machine interface, especially over the long longitudinal training with a sufficiently long period of training, most people seem to learn, and this learning process is correlated with the fact that they are changing the patterns that they are volitionally modulating in order to achieve this better control. It seems that we are inducing some plasticity. In other ways, the long-term use of a BCI, by definition, when people learn to use the BCI, is coupled to some this plasticity process. So this means that this BCI can also be used not just as an assistive device, but also as a rehabilitation device. And so let me show you this other experiment where we were testing whether in fact a BCI can be used, and you know that it is the case, for rehabilitation. But in order to use a BCI for rehabilitation, we need to take a closer look at what does it mean to execute a volitional movement when we have a healthy body. Body, and I mean brain too. So we know that whenever we are executing a movement, we are not only delivering the correct efferent command that will contract the target muscles. We equally fundamental in order for us to learn this motor skill, it is the fact that this efferent command is associated to an afferent feedback, the proprioceptive feedback that is telling us that indeed we are doing the movement that we wanted to do in the correct way. How can we couple that in the case of a BCI? By providing, as you can see over here, proprioceptive feedback via neuromuscular stimulation, electrical stimulation, where we will be delivering small currents over the peripheral nerves, in this case, the extensors, because this is the task that the subject want to do, so that whenever the BCI decodes the intention to execute this extension, it will trigger the neuromuscular electrical stimulation to deliver these small currents, and this will elicit the contraction of the muscles via the activation of the peripheral nerves. And the important thing is that proprioceptive feedback in the case of neuromuscular electrical stimulation is very rich, because it will start before the actual contraction of the muscles, as it is the case in natural motor control. So let me show you the basic of this clinical trial. We recruited 27 chronic stroke patients. We split them in two groups: the actual BCI-NE group, where, as I mentioned before, whenever the BCI was decoding the intention of the patient to execute an extension of the wrist and fingers, something that the patients, none of the patients could do by themselves, the NMS will trigger these, the extensors in order to execute the movement. Oh, sorry for that. And then 13 weren't allocated to a sham group. What is sham in this case? Sham means that the subjects were equipped with the same apparatus, the EEG, the NMES. They were receiving the same instructions, attempt to do the movement, and if the BCI will decode, it will trigger the NMES. But in fact, there was no BCI. The stimulation was random, and we make sure that the distribution of the NEMS in the two groups was similar. So all the patients were chronic, meaning that at least they had to be 10 months after their stroke. They were also on a stable phase of the recovery, meaning that they were not improving for a certain amount of time. They were all moderate to severe arm disability, but they didn't have mobility of their hand. And they did a 5-week intervention, 2 sessions per week. And this is the main clinical outcome in terms of the Fugl-Meyer score. This is a score, as you know, of functional disability, so that the higher it is, the better they are. And you can see that at the very beginning, the two groups, the red BCI and in blue cyan, the sham, had similar level of FMA scores. But only the BCI group at the end of the intervention improved this Fugl-Meyer assessment score in a way that this improvement was not only statistically significant with respect to before, it was also statistically significant with respect to what the sham group achieved. And more importantly, this improvement was clinically significant, meaning that the subjects could do things that they couldn't do before. Moreover, when the subjects finish, you have here the exact values of their Fugl-Meyer scores. They went home, and we called them back in between 6 to 12 months later, on average 9 months later, whenever they were available. And you can see that whatever they recover was maintained 9 months later. So it seems that indeed a BCI can open windows of brain plasticity. And what kind of plasticity did we find when we analyze changes in their EEG? In particular, what we found is changes in connectivity. And we were using directed connectivity, meaning how much information is flowing from point A to point B. And in particular, we were interested in the connectivity, intraconnectivity in the damaged hemisphere. So if we had subjects that had either a lesion on the left or on the right hemisphere, we were flipping all the right damaged patients over the left so that we can combine all together. And what we found is that when we computed the somatosensory connectivity over the damaged hemisphere, you can see that at before the intervention, there was no significant flow of information inside the damaged hemisphere. And after the intervention, only the BCI group exhibited an increase in this connectivity, meaning that we were reactivating the damaged sensory motor cortex. This increase in connectivity was also correlated with the increase in Fugger-Meyer, meaning the improvement in function. So this is a correlation. We cannot say that there is a causal relationship between the increase in connectivity. So changes, activity-dependent plasticity, and increasing in improvement, functional improvement. We are working on that these days, but this was a strong indication that that both seem to be not only correlated, that they are needed to do so. So in order to further explore this component of activity-dependent neuroplasticity, we can take a look at the decoders that the BCIs were implementing. And even if the sham group didn't use any BCI, we can use the BCI decoder that we can build for them and check their performance during their intervention, the clinical trial. So in the case of BCI, we were hoping that their performance was sufficiently high, and indeed it was quite high. It was 86% on average. In the case of sham, we were hypothesizing that because of the design of our intervention, the performance of the BCI had to be random, and in fact, it was random. And most importantly, what we can see is the evolution. Remember, we are accumulating evidence in our decoders because our decoders are statistical decoders. So that if 0 is the moment where the decoder crosses, in the case of the BCI, a certain threshold and will trigger the NMES, we can see that indeed there is this increase in accuracy that is maintained also a few milliseconds after the time 0 is when the NMS is delivered. But we can also see this, the evolution, or observe the evolution of the accuracy of the decoders in the case of the sham group, when 0 is when the NMS was randomly triggered. And you can see that this is essentially flat, 50%. There is no change. And we can see very clearly how around the moment of delivering the NMM, yes, we have a clear separation and a clear increase in accuracy for the BCI group, but not for the sham group. And this is what we hypothesized was driving this neuroplasticity process, activity-dependent neuroplasticity. Very good. Now I would like to introduce you some new work that we are doing, because the question is, it seems that accuracy is essential for people to recover function during a neurorehabilitation session. But we also saw, let me come back to this slide over here, that not every subject in the BCI group improved. There were a few subjects who didn't improve, actually. Probably because even if as a group the BCI performance was very high, this was not the case for all of them. And more importantly, there is a training period for them to achieve good BCI control. Whereas in a neurorehabilitation setting, we like patients to achieve a good performance right at the beginning in order to maximize the window of opportunity for this activity-dependent neuroplasticity to happen. So the question is, how can we accelerate this training process to make most of the subjects, is not all, to improve the performance quickly? Here, I will be showing you now some work that we have very recently published on the use of Riemannian decoders and the use of transfer learning. But let me motivate that. We want now to develop machine learning algorithms that will be supporting the subject training process. We don't want to replace the subject training process, because we observe at the very beginning that this might not support subject training. So what we will be doing in our case is that if we visualize the distribution in the Riemannian space, that, as you know, it is in the covariance space, it is a manifold where eventually for this expert subject, we can find a good hyperplane that will be separating the two distributions. A property of the Riemannian space is that we have an identity point. And now what we can do is to project this distribution of the expert subject around the identity. This projection will preserve all the distance properties of the original distribution. And now, whenever we have a new naive subject, we will be projecting every sample that they are producing also on this identity, so that hopefully this distribution for the naive subject will be sufficiently close to the distribution of the expert subject, so that we can use the trained decoder for the expert subject, that is very good, also for the naive subject. Of course, this decoder at the very beginning, we hope that will provide consistent, good feedback to the subject, but will not be the ideal decoder for this subject. The subject will still need to go through the training process in order to achieve the best possible brain control that they can have. So let me show you the experiments that we did. Subjects were using the decoder of the expert, and in every single training session, they were learning to control a very basic bar. This is the simplest of the BCI experiments that we can do, so that they need to bring the bar to the right or to the left up to a certain probability threshold. This is the threshold, the accumulation threshold that we have in our approach. And also learning to control this simulated car in a car racing task. And this comes from the Cybertron that was done a couple of years ago. They had to control this car. And so they first did a certain number of runs, so group of trials with the bar task, and immediately afterwards they were doing a certain number of runs on the car racing task. We had 18 subjects in total, and we divided them in 2 groups. And now let me start with the first of these groups of 9 subjects, where they were using this basic approach of recentering that I mentioned to you before, that is completely unsupervised, using the Riemannian approach. So in a nutshell, what you have over here is the evolution of performance in terms of command delivery, and for that we were using the kappa value for the bar task, and you can see that they were improving over time. In fact, there was a linear increase that was statistically very strong, strongly significant. And in the case of the race game, they were also improving the performance. And in this case, performance was not simply the kappa value, was how fast they could finish the race. And you can see that again, there is a very strong linear correlation over time, where they were improving better and better and better over the course of 5 sessions. More importantly, when we take the performance of every single subject for each of the 2 tasks at the very beginning, and you see that this is already a decent performance, how many of them were capable to statistically improve their performance at the end of these 5 days of training? 9 out of 9 subjects improve. In the case of the bar, all the subjects improved their performance in the case of the race game. We can also do the same exercise that we did for the wheelchair, saying how much the features that are encoding that are the input to our decoder are evolving in terms of discriminability or distinctiveness over time. So you can see that in both cases, for the bar and for the race, over time, there was a strong linear improvement in discriminability or distinctiveness of those features, meaning the subjects are capable to modulate better and better their patterns. And which are those patterns? Well, let's take a look. This is the original on the left, pattern in terms of CS scores of the ESPER subject. And the ESPER subject was trained only on the bar task. Now, you may believe or you may expect that because the subjects were using, the naive subjects, were using the decoder of the experts because of operant conditioning, they should converge to the same distribution or zeta score topoplot of the expert. But no, this is not the case. The subjects were converging to a different topoplot. And this is the average across all of them. In the paper, you can see in the supplementary material that every subject was converging to a different pattern. They are individual. More importantly, they were training every single day to control the bar task and to control the car in the race game. Well, the control patterns to which subjects converge in each of the 2 tasks were different. not only different to the experts, but different between the two tasks. And again, in the supplementary material, you will see the differences. And this is, I consider, important and critical, that this algorithm is not only helping subjects to achieve good performance at the very beginning, this algorithm is supporting subject training so that every single subject will learn their individual modulation of brain signals that will allow them to control each task optimally. And this is also reflecting that in the same way we use the same part of our body differently for different skills, subjects can modulate their brain rhythms using a BCI differently for different tasks. Now, let me conclude this experiment with the other half of the subjects. Because the other half of the subjects, 9 subjects again, were trained with a supervised version of this generic recentering algorithm that was completely unsupervised. How? Because we were using the first run in every session that was only done on the bar task to optimize the parameters of the decoder. So in this case, the parameters of the decoder don't change. It is simply a recentering of the new sample over the original distribution. In this case, at the very beginning, there is a short personalization of the parameters of the decoder, and then afterwards, everything was the generic. There is no more supervision. So we are taking the two sides of the lessons that we are learning. To make a long story short, we couldn't observe any statistical difference in performance between the two algorithms in the two groups of subjects. This supervised bar algorithms was exhibiting a trend to better performance, especially at the very beginning, thanks to this personalization, supervised personalization, but at the very end of their training, and even during every single session, we couldn't never find any statistical difference in performance, even if PAR was initially better, but not statistically better. Nevertheless, because most probably the training effort that every single subject has to provide for the generic algorithm, the unsupervised generic group of subjects exhibited better learning effects than the supervised group of subjects, meaning that more subjects in this unsupervised group improve their performance over time, comparing the first towards the fifth session. How am I doing? Do we still have a few more minutes?
Yes, you are 5 minutes past the hour, but I guess we can wait. So
okay, so it is a good time for me to stop over here. Okay. Because what I want to say that in parallel to this algorithm, we are also using complementary approaches to drive this learning process. And these complementary approaches, I don't have now time to show you anything, are based on the fact that if we think about the original problem that is somehow causing these limitations of current BCIs in terms of non-stationarity of our data, can be compensated by mechanisms that essentially are neuromodulation techniques. Why so? Because the reasoning that we are following is that this non-stationarity happens because subjects are not using the full natural control of motor control. where we have efferent signals, afferent feedback that somehow constrain the dynamics of the brain activity that we are using to decode the intention of the subject. Whereas if we use neuromodulation techniques, we can constrain the dynamics of the patterns, rhythmic activity of the brain, so that we will be reducing the non-stationarity. We have now very strong results supporting this fact. I don't have time to present that, so that the two techniques are complementary. And something that we have done very recently is that we are combining this unsupervised recentering process Riemannian algorithm together with one of these neuromodulation techniques, and we can observe that the combination of the two is much better than simply this Riemannian algorithm, that it was already quite strong. I stop over here. Thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I am open to any questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Jose. It was a very good talk. So I think the most efficient way to take questions is if you just, raise your virtual hand, and then I will give you your order.
So I will stop now sharing, so that now we have a conversation, and I can also see who is asking.
All right. Maybe I can start with the first question. So it's more of a clarification. So if I understood correctly, let's say comparing the two studies, the first one and the last one, what do you think? So in the first one, essentially, you argued, we argued that the machine learning process somehow made the subject lazy and didn't really help its learning. Actually, it just kept it to the bare minimum to achieve the performance. And then my question is, how does in the latest study, the machine learning algorithm achieves the opposite? How exactly does this happen?
So I like to look at this problem from the old reinforcement learning framework, where you had an actor and a critic. So that and the critic is somehow the machine learning in our case, and the actor is the subject. So if the critic that is providing feedback to the reinforcement learning agent, because operant conditioning is a kind of reinforcement learning, you want to maximize the reward that you are receiving. If the critic is changing too fast, this is confusing the actor. The actor cannot learn any policy. And in addition, if the critic is smart enough to provide very good feedback, well, there is no reason for the actor to do anything. It is receiving high rewards, isn't it? So this is why the first algorithm that was changing at a very high pace for every single trial, there was a modification of the parameters. And this distribution of parameters converges very quickly to good performance. Mm-hmm. Now, in the new algorithms, or in general, any algorithm that you may think of, and it is essential, and this is why I was reporting this wheelchair experiment, where we were taking somehow the other extreme in BCI, meaning we fixed our decoders for a long time so that it is the subject who has to adapt. So the critic is fixed and the actor has to learn. Mm-hmm. Of course, this is more than operant conditioning and original neurofeedback, because we start with a good distribution already. But anyway, and we are modifying only occasionally so as to help the subject learn. Now, in the new algorithm, we are saying we will find an algorithm, in this case, a projection, a recentering, that hopefully will reduce the effects of non-stationarity, one, and second, will bring the distribution of these samples, EEG samples, generated by the naive subject sufficiently close to the distribution of the expert. So these will be better than random, better than what we can achieve by any other means. So now that the subject has a good initial performance, consistent feedback, the subject can learn way faster over time. We are promoting this learning process. This is our interpretation of this algorithm.
All right, so you're saying you are giving two good distributions in the beginning and possible, let's say in the learnable manifold, and essentially then you're asking the subject to learn.
Yeah.
All right, so
yeah.
All right, so we have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm gonna read them out. Alberto says, thank you very much for the talk, Jose. I wonder if you could explain a bit further how was the Riemannian centering that you mentioned? So I guess it's the question about the technique.
So the important point here is that in this Riemannian space, there is an identity. And this is because of the properties of the Riemannian space. So since we have an identity, take it as the origin of this complex hyperdimensional space, we can project the distribution of the expert that can be anywhere in this manifold to the origin, to the identity. And the good property of this Riemannian geometry is that this transformation will preserve all the properties of the original original distribution. We are simply moving to the center, preserving all the other properties of the original distributions. Now that we have that center on a common origin, we can take the distribution of the samples as they come, and this is why it is unsupervised. We don't know whether it is class 1, class 2. We are simply saying, okay, it falls over here, but let me project it over the identity. And this will make somehow the two distributions fit each other. Of course, they will not be the same. There will be a little shift, a little rotation, but they will be way more similar than if we simply look at them each in their part of the manifold. I hope that this clarifies this essential point of the algorithm.
Okay, thank you. And there is a question from Jerry. How many channels did you use for the EEG car racing and wheelchair task? Do you think it will be possible to use a smaller number of channels, 8 to 16, to perform similar tasks so that we can make it more accessible?
I don't think that there is any limitation. I believe that we were using 22 channels for this.
Well, for the wheelchair, we had 32. It was an 8.
Yeah, but remember that we are also using 32 in this case. But remember that we were removing the peripheral because they are very prone to artifacts. And this is why at the end, if I remember correctly, we only had 22, like in the wheelchair.
Yeah.
This is, so I don't think that it is a problem of the number of electrodes. We wanted to be sure that we had enough information because this was the basic experiment. And by the way, I want to take this opportunity to emphasize something that is somehow conceptual. Why we were comparing only left versus right, that is the simplest SMR sensory motor rhythm BCI that we can build. Why not to, if this is so powerful, why not to go for more complex movements? Well, because we were hypothesizing that this would support subject learning. And we wanted to support subject learning with changes in the patterns that they were modulating. So the reason why we were choosing left versus right is that we have an excellent literature telling us what is the pattern of sensory motor rhythms associated to left, to right, whereas whenever we choose any other complex movement, who knows which is that pattern? So we don't have any reference. And this is why I was showing you at the end these average patterns across subjects, so as to show you that yes, they were modulating what we expect, but they were different for every task and with respect to the expert subject. You can find those so that we can make a reliable interpretation that yes, they are converging to something that is physiologically meaningful, something that you cannot do with a more complex task.
All right, thank you. I believe Teresa Vaughan is next.
Good morning. Thank you for this lovely talk, Jose. I think that my question is about learning retention. So you showed that immediately after training, you had no difference in groups. I think I got that right? In the supervised, unsupervised groups. So I just wondered, have you looked, and also even in the wheelchair study that you showed in the beginning, or now this most recent data that you published in, and you talked about at the end, what about retention? Are you seeing differences in how people are, have you looked at that at all?
No, we have not, and this is an excellent question. This is something that we are investigating these days. And this other experiment with neuromodulation that I mentioned, we did that. We asked subjects to come 1 week later, and they were exhibiting similar levels of performance, similar patterns. So it seems that this training was sufficient for them to consolidate some basic skills. Now, it is 5 days enough? Who knows?
Yeah. Right, and still no different. I mean, for instance, in the groups where you were
comparing. We were not comparing because at that moment in that experiment we were only using the unsupervised. We didn't want to, because whenever you add a new element, you are multiplying the number of arms in your design that you need to have. So yes, we would like to answer all those questions, but in practice it is quite difficult. You need to come up with one single hypothesis and only to have at most 2 arms, because otherwise it is too complex and too expensive.
Thank you. So Luca, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you, Jose, for the presentation. It was I really enjoyed it. I have a curiosity. So I totally understand the fact that, if you have 2 elements trying to learn, it gets confusing. It's just having 2 controllers trying to control the same system. They fight each other. They get into instabilities, basically. So that's totally understandable. And I agree. I mean, I understand why the need to have a slower adapting machine element. I was wondering, I mean, because the user perceives the ground shifting under their feet, and they have to continuously changing strategy. Yeah. So I wonder whether you've tried informing, I mean, when you do change strategy because the machine improves, whether informing the user about the fact that now we are, experimenting with a slight variation. So if you feel something, shifting or changing, it's normal. It's not like it's not like you've unlearned something. It's just the machine changing strategy. Have you done that, considered that? What do you think about it?
You're making a very nice point. And in fact, I was not discussing this part with in the wheelchair experiment with the 3 tetraplegic. We had this phenomenon where the subject 3, who was in the middle of performance, had a deterioration, a substantial deterioration in performance when we believe we had found a decoder, so change in the parameters of the decoders that was strongly better than the previous one. We didn't tell anything to the subject. The performance degraded. He was completely confused. And it was only when we explained to the subject, hey, we have changed, that somehow he recovered. But this is very anecdotal to support your point, but I totally agree that we need to inform subjects of what the machine learning is doing, because we don't want machine learning to be a black box.
All right, thank you. And Eduardo, you can go ahead.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much, Jose, for the nice presentation. I think it was really interesting, and you're doing quite similar things that we are doing here in the University of Valladolid, where I'm working now. Well, my question is, because I think your approach of training a model with an expert subject and try a naive subject to adapt his brain patterns to these expert patterns, okay? If you could apply this approach to the stroke rehabilitation, to stroke rehabilitation, because I think it would be very interesting, and I don't know if you agree, and I want to know your opinion. If you could train a model with healthy subjects and try to foster the learning of the person with stroke to adapt his brain patterns, to adapt his activity to this model which is trained with healthy subjects. Do you think this could make sense? Have you tried anything like that, or are you planning to do it? Thank you very much.
Okay, this is an excellent question, as any question that I am getting today. You need to read the paper, and you need to see the last sentence in the discussion. We are saying that. But I want to clarify something, and this is essential. We are not expecting people to match the modulations of the expert. And this is essential, not only for healthy people, but more so for stroke patients. Because if it is the case that the healthy people will be modulating, in the case of a hand movement, the hand knob area, and this is the area that the stroke patient has a damage on, no way they will never be able to achieve good performance, isn't it? Because they can't modulate that area. What our algorithm and what I want to promote is that because of this realignment, we are coming to two distributions that are not the same, that they are sufficiently close to each other so as to receive good, consistent feedback. And with that, the subject will converge to their own individual distribution. And I hope that this was clear in the results that I was presenting. In the case of a patient, you want them to modulate the perilesional areas in a way that no healthy subject will do, because they have a healthy, prominent hand knob area.
I think that's the key, no? How you can bring the brain patterns of the stroke person to the healthy person, but maintaining the individuality and of the model. I think that's
so. Let me go a little bit more on the technicalities of these of any machine learning, but in the particular of this machine learning. So, do you remember, for those of you who were practicing with support vector machines, that was a revolution when they came. And the trick of support vector machines, so normally when we do machine learning, we are saying, okay, we need to reduce, especially for BCI, we need to reduce the dimensionality of our data, of the input space, because we will never be able to collect enough calibration data to estimate properly the parameters of a very large decoder, complex decoder. The trick of support vector machines is to say, no matter which is your input space, you need to project in a way larger, high dimensional input space, so that there, the separability between the distributions will be easier to find, isn't it?
Yeah.
This was the trick, and this is the essential trick of support vector machines. Riemannian spaces, because they work with covariances, this is an incredibly large high-dimensional space. So this is why we expect that in that space, the two distributions cannot be the same, yet the separability along the borderline, the frontier estimated by the expert will be still be good. But everyone will have different distributions along that hyperplane.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. That was very clarifying. Thank you.
All right, thank you. There is one more question in the chat, so I will read it out. So if I understood properly, for the wheelchair experiment, some people had no improvement. This can be an outcome if the participant is not engaged enough in the experiment. Can you please explain how you monitored the engagement? And have you considered the different mental conditions of the participants, like fatigue or boredom?
Okay, very good question. No, the short answer is no. We didn't check for their attention or their level of fatigue or anything like that. Why? Because I don't know of any reliable BCI that can estimate that over days. And if you know of one, please let me know, but I don't know of any. The other reason is that we were working with these severely disabled people in a very individual manner, in the sense that we were making sure that they wanted to continue the experiment, and we stopped it whenever they were saying, I am tired, or whenever we were saying that their performance was not going in the right direction, because this is a sign of fatigue. The other thing is that, and I didn't insist much on that, is that actually this subject who didn't exhibit any learning was the subject who had the highest performance at the very beginning. So he was very happy with the original performance because it was way higher than anyone else. The problem is that this performance was sufficiently good, probably not to motivate the person to continue the learning process or to support the learning process. We don't know why. And this is why we keep kicking our head against the walls to find how we can design protocols and strategies as close as possible to natural motor control and skill acquisition that will support this learning process.
All right, thank you. I don't see another question for now, so I will exploit my position to ask one more myself. So this is more on the general context. So the two pillars, at least in my opinion, of what you presented is a non-invasive and subject learning, or at least shift more towards subject learning. And somehow, in my opinion, again, at least, these are both kind of unpopular, right? So nowadays it's all about invasive, especially when we're talking for the BCI field, or at least that's what is fashionable. And, you know, funders and people seem to think more highly of it. And also subject learning, not so much. I mean, again, maybe even more than invasive. It's all about machine learning, right? So do you think we are going to be out of business? Is there a future for these lines of research? Or I don't know, are we getting outdated?
Let me be provocative. If we need, well, actually, I don't think I am provocative. If you need to make a choice between invasive against non-invasive and saying only one can survive, which one? I bet, and I bet my whole arm, that the one that will win is the non-invasive. Why? And this, I am seeing it here in the land of invasiveness, that when you talk to clinicians, they definitely prefer the non-invasive for their patients. Think about the stroke. There is not a good reason to implant anything in the perilesional area of a stroke, because this can increase the level of damage substantially.
But what about assistive technology? Because the argument on for neurorehabilitation, yes, I see it. But for assistive technology, and especially for dexterous neuroprosthetics, I don't know.
But now we need to be aware that every technology has some limitations. So you cannot use an EEG of ears to achieve control, finger control, because we don't have the spatial resolution, isn't it? No way you can do it. Or maybe yes. And
Maybe
this is where I hope that the new generative AI can help.
All right, thank you. I don't know, Anna, do you want to take over? No? I don't think there is another question, so maybe we can thank Jose and hope to have you physically at some point here too.
It would
Yeah,
be very
not
nice
here in
to.
China. Okay.
Very good. It has been very nice spending time with you and sharing with you our results. And yes, you were saying we hope to have a collaboration. Sure.
Yeah, we will.
And I hope that we can meet in person. So if any of you is coming to the US, please let me know, and I will be very happy to organize a visit here in Austin.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Have a
much.
nice
Good to see
end
you.
of the day
Bye,
over there.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.